Hello and welcome to the NewsMine podcast show. I'm your host, Everett Tracy, and today's guest is Fred Jordan, a surgical technician from Blytheville, Arkansas, but now living in Dallas, Texas. Fred will be joining us in discussing today's topic. Is the American dream still alive in 2025? Fred, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me. This is definitely something that's been on my mind a lot lately.
Same here. You know, I was reading this report last week that said the median home price in America hit $420,000 this year. When I think about what the American dream used to mean, owning a home, having a stable job, supporting a family, that number just blows my mind. What does the American dream mean to you in 2025?
Man, that's a loaded question. Growing up, I always thought it meant you work hard, you get rewarded, you could buy a house, maybe take a vacation once a year, not worry about every single bill. But now, I make decent money as a surgical tech, and I'm still wondering if I'll ever be able to afford a house.
This is very true, Fred. The numbers are pretty stark when you look at them. According to recent data, you need to make about $106,000 a year to afford the median priced home in America. That's way more than most people make. What are you seeing in terms of wages in healthcare?
Healthcare pays better than a lot of fields, but it's still not keeping up with costs. I started as a surgical tech 5 years ago, making about $45,000. Now I'm up to around $55,000, which sounds good until you realize rent has gone up 30% in that same time period. My apartment that cost $1,200 5 years ago is now $1,560.
Yeah, and that's pretty typical across the country. The National Low Income Housing Coalition reported that there's not a single state where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a two-bedroom rental. Not one state. That's insane.
It really is, and it's not just housing. I was at the grocery store yesterday, and I spent $85 and barely filled half a cart. Ground beef was $7.99 a pound. A gallon of milk was $4.29. These are basic necessities, and they're pricing people out.
I totally agree here with you, Fred. The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows food prices have increased about 25% since 2020. Gas prices, even though they've come down from their peaks, are still averaging around $3.50 a gallon nationally. Everything costs more, but paychecks aren't keeping up. What do you think is driving this?
I think there are multiple factors. Corporate profits have been hitting record highs while wages stay flat. I read that CEO compensation has increased by over 1,400% since 1978, while typical worker compensation has only gone up about 18%. That gap is just getting wider and wider.
Yeah, this is insane. And then there's the student debt crisis. The Federal Reserve reports that Americans owe over $1.7 trillion in student loans. That's trillion with a T. How has that affected people, you know?
It's devastating. I was lucky. I went to community college for my surgical tech program, so I only have about $25,000 in debt. But I know people with bachelor's degrees who owe $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 or more. They're making payments that are like a second rent payment every month. How are you supposed to save for a house when you're paying $800 a month in student loans?
Yeah, that's so true, Fred. And the housing market has become this vicious cycle. People can't afford to buy, so they rent. High demand for rentals drives up rent prices. Meanwhile, home prices keep climbing because there's limited supply, and everyone who can afford it is competing for the same properties.
Exactly. And it's not just individuals competing anymore. I've been looking at houses, and I'm competing against investment firms that are buying up properties to turn into rentals. They can pay cash, close in a week. How is a regular person supposed to compete with that?
That's a real issue. BlackRock and other investment firms have been buying up thousands of single-family homes. Some estimates say investors now own about 20% of single-family rental homes in major markets. It's basically turning home ownership into a luxury for the wealthy.
And meanwhile, politicians are talking about economic growth and job creation, but they're not addressing the fundamental issue that wages haven't kept up with the cost of living. The federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. That hasn't changed since 2009. 16 years with no increase.
Yeah, can't agree more, Fred. Even states that have raised their minimum wages, California's is $16 an hour now. It's still not enough in most places. You need to work about 100 hours a week at $16 an hour just to afford the average one-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles.
It's unsustainable. And what frustrates me is when people say, just get a better job or work harder. I work in an operating room. I'm on my feet for 12-hour shifts, dealing with life and death situations. I work hard, but hard work doesn't automatically translate to being able to afford the American dream anymore.
Let's talk about healthcare for a minute, since that's your field. Medical bankruptcy is still a leading cause of personal bankruptcy in America, even for people with insurance. What are you seeing?
It's heartbreaking. People avoid getting medical care because they can't afford it. I've seen patients who delayed surgery because they were worried about the cost, and by the time they come in, their condition is much worse. Health insurance premiums keep going up, deductibles keep going up, but coverage seems to get worse.
Yeah, that's so sad. The average family health insurance premium is now over $22,000 a year, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation. Even with employer contributions, families are paying thousands out of pocket just for premiums before they even use their insurance.
And that's if you're lucky enough to have employer-sponsored insurance. Gig workers, freelancers, small business owners, they're on their own trying to navigate the individual market, which is even more expensive.
Speaking of gig work, that's become a huge part of the economy. Uber, DoorDash, TaskRabbit, people are hustling just to make ends meet. Is that the new American dream? The side hustle?
I think for a lot of people, it's become necessary, not a choice. I know nurses who drive for Uber on their days off, teachers who deliver food at night. It's not about getting ahead anymore, it's about staying afloat.
The Federal Reserve found that 37% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency expense without borrowing money or selling something. That's not prosperity, that's survival mode.
Exactly. And when you're in survival mode, you can't take risks, you can't start a business, you can't go back to school, you can't invest in yourself. You're just trying to make it through each month.
And Fred, what about the wealth gap? The top 1% of Americans now control about 35% of all wealth, while the bottom 50% control just 2%. How does that affect the average person's ability to achieve the American dream?
It means the ladder is getting longer and the rungs are getting further apart. When wealth concentrates at the top like that, it removes money from the middle class economy. Rich people don't spend all their money. They invest it, often in things that don't create jobs for regular people.
And then there's the political aspect. Lobbying spending hit a record $4.3 billion last year. When big corporations and wealthy interests can essentially buy influence, how much say do regular Americans really have in policies that affect their lives?
That's what really gets to me. We can vote, but it feels like the real decisions are being made in boardrooms and by lobbyists. Tax policy, housing policy, healthcare policy, it all seems designed to benefit the people who already have money and power.
But let's not end on a completely pessimistic note. Are there any signs of hope, any reasons to think the American dream might adapt and survive?
I think technology is creating some new opportunities. People can start online businesses, work remotely, learn new skills through YouTube and online courses. The barriers to starting something are lower in some ways than they used to be.
That's true. And there does seem to be more awareness of these issues. Labor unions are having a resurgence. Young people are more politically engaged. There's growing support for policies like raising the minimum wage, making college more affordable, addressing housing costs.
Right? And maybe the American dream needs to evolve. Maybe it's not about owning a big house with a white picket fence anymore. Maybe it's about having security, healthcare, the ability to retire someday without working until you die.
Yeah, makes sense. Financial security instead of wealth accumulation. That seems more realistic and maybe more sustainable too.
Exactly. And I do think change is possible, but it's going to require systemic changes, not just individual effort. We need policies that make healthcare affordable, education accessible, housing attainable for working people.
The question is whether we can make those changes before the dream becomes completely out of reach for the majority of Americans.
I think we have to try. The alternative is accepting that America becomes a country where only the wealthy can achieve stability and prosperity, and that's not the America I want to live in.
Well said. Any final thoughts on whether the American dream is still alive in 2025?
I think it's on life support, but it's not dead yet. It's going to require a lot of work to revive it, and it might look different than it did for previous generations. But the idea that hard work should be rewarded with a decent life, that's still worth fighting for.
Yeah, I completely agree, Fred. Thanks for the great conversation. And for those of you tuning in, if you've ever wondered what America might feel like if equality was truly real, that's exactly what I write about in my book, If America Was Equal. It's available right now on Amazon. Links in the bio. Go check it out. That's all for today's show. Have a great day, and I'll catch you next time.